Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session for ACDA Voices United. We're so glad that you're able to join us for one of our live in-person presentations. Today, we'll be talking about gender bias in the choral rehearsals with Dr. Marianne East. Dr. East is the music director at Community of Faith United Methodist Church in Herndon. She teaches at George Mason University and is the founding artistic director of the Capitol Harmonia Women's Chorus. This session comes out of the work that she did for her doctoral dissertation at Boston University. So without further ado, Dr. East, we'd love to hear what you have to share with us today. The end of the, one more thing, sorry. At the end of the presentation, we'll be taking the chat questions that you put into the YouTube session, and we'll be giving them to Dr. East. So any of the questions that you have during the presentation, feel free to put those in the chat or send them to the email address listed in the comments, and we'll be able to share those with Dr. East at the end.
Thank you so much, CJ. And behind the scenes, I want to make sure I say thank you to Amy Moyer, who is our technician for this session. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to share some of the findings from my dissertation research, but talk about what it means. Of course, we were all planning to be in person. And so I really wanted this to be a discussion kind of session. That's not possible, so it's taking a slightly different slant. But I do really welcome your questions so that I've left plenty of time at the end so that we can have a little bit of dialogue, so to speak, in our technical world. So let me just share my screen real quick and we will get moving. So I'm showing my age with this little introduction. Hey, you guys! I don't know how many of you remember the original Electric Company, but when I was thinking about a title for this session, this is what came to mind, is how many times do we address our students, our choristers, as guys, right? Guys meaning all. And so as soon as I thought of that, Electric Company was the first thing that came to my mind. So gender bias in the choral classroom / rehearsal. My doctoral dissertation work focused on music education and the secondary choral classroom. But as I am a former secondary teacher, college teacher, church musician, community choir director, I realized how this conversation really goes into any choral situation and really any educational situation for that matter. So the topic of gender has entered music education many, many times in many different ways. We have a focus. We want to make sure that we're studying and performing music of women composers and learning about women musicians. Recently, the discussion has come up around definition of gender itself and whether we need to rethink how we name and how we even costume our ensembles. These are all valid and important discussions to have. I also propose that it doesn't go quite deep enough. Names and clothes are just the surface. My doctoral dissertation tackled this subject, and what I found in my research is that language, how we structure our choral programs, and patriarchal attitudes all play key roles in negotiating gender in the choral rehearsal. So first, let's define gender itself. For my research, I used Butler's definition of performative gender, along with Connell's view that gender is situational. So in other words, gender is not biological, but based on society's view of what it means to be a man, woman, boy, girl. And of course we know gender is not binary. There are those that identify as non-binary. There are those that identify as transgender. There's a lot of vocabulary that goes into gender, and we have to start thinking larger than that dichotomous male, female, man, woman. Gender has been studied in the realm of choral music, but mostly in the sense of the male changing voice, how to recruit and retain boys in choral programs, which we'll talk about later on. So what is the problem? So the problem is that as I was looking at, again, focusing on choral music education, but this can translate to other choral situations, the U.S. choral music education seems to be stuck. We continue to expand things like repertoire with world music, pop music, current composers, composers of color, but the overall method of how we teach and how we run a rehearsal really hasn't changed much. Textbooks, many university textbooks. I did a quick Google search. It was not sophisticated research, but just a curiosity question as I was going through this. I did a quick Google search for syllabi for different choral methods classes in different universities and colleges. And many of them are still using the same text that I used 20 years ago. There's some good information in those texts. We shouldn't throw them out, but there's a lot that's missing or just kind of outdated. Many of the texts assume that we teach what I deemed a universal singer, that they all learn the same way, they all sing the same way, they all have the same vocal mechanism. Yes and no. Many students are learning in many, many different ways. How many of you, again, I know you can't answer to me directly, but think about this. How many of you had a choral or a music course within your School of Music study about myriad special education needs? Not just that they existed, but really talked about them, about how to address them in your choral classroom. How many of you really learned how to support an IEP, even how to read an IEP? Which could be a whole different presentation. Many of these texts also don't address repertoire outside of SATB Western music. There's no seating charts for a treble choir. How should I place my SSA? How should I place my TTBB? The only time gender is really mentioned in any of these textbooks, again, is going back to that male changing voice, which may get a chapter. And then the female changing voice, which we know does change, maybe gets a paragraph. Not a whole lot of discussion about it. And if you think about your typical choral rehearsal, just about anywhere, again, not just in the classroom, but church choir rehearsal, community choir, the bell rings or there's some sort of demarcation that rehearsal is about to start. Singers get their music. The director, perhaps another singer, leads warm-ups. We sight sing, maybe a little bit more during assessment time. And then the director leads the rehearsal and the singers do what they're told. Right? And that has not changed a lot over time in general. Of course, there are lots of people doing some different things, but the general structure has not changed much over time. So a little bit about my study so that you can understand where my data came from. So I conducted a multiple case study. So 4 cases, 4 different high schools. I had 2 female directors or directors that identified as female, and I had 2 that identified as male. I was hoping to have somebody who perhaps identified as transgender or non-binary, but with my survey that didn't come up. I had a pre-interview before I came to observe them and a post-interview. And then I did classroom observations. And so with each of my directors, I wanted to observe them with one of their mixed choirs and then either a men or a women's choir. And for now, we are going to talk about men's choir and women's choir. We'll talk about a little bit how that's changing next. But at this time of my research, and these particular schools, that's how their choirs were named. So my 4 directors, we're going to call them Abby, Bobby, Chris, and Diane, ABCD, as I share some of their information with you. So what I found is that, or I guess I should talk about a little bit what I looked at in the rehearsals. I audio recorded the rehearsals so that I could go back and listen again, as well as took notes. And what I was looking for was a combination of, do we teach a mixed choir differently than we teach either a women's chorus or a men's chorus? And then looking at the gender of the director. Do they teach differently? Do they teach, if it was a woman with a women's choir, is that a different dynamic than a woman with a men's choir? And looking at all the different dynamics. And so what I found was, and of course we all have to admit this, we have gender biases. As much as we might not want to have them, we all have them. And so they kind of fell into different categories. They fell into categories that people were aware of or conscious that they held, that they outright spoke about. And then ones that were held unconsciously, that either they said one thing, but then when I observed, they did a different thing. Or just seeing things in that observation that didn't come up in our interview. So going through some of our gender biases that are held consciously, they came in about 4 different categories. The first one being attitudes of hegemonic masculinity. And so what that means is that idea of boys only like sports. All of those kind of boy things that we're taught in society that really have no scientific basis to them, but they're these generally held beliefs. And so one of the things that Abby was talking about in her interview was that she was very aware that if she's talking to a boy at the school, she was at a suburban high school, and somebody that maybe she heard singing in the hallway at his locker or something like that, that she didn't want to go up and say, "You have a great voice." Because in her mind, oh, no, boys don't have good voices. They don't like to sing. So instead, she would talk to them about sports. "Hey, I see you play lacrosse," and would start the conversation there, because there was this feeling that she had to start there in order to engage him, and then work her way back to, "Hey, I also heard you singing." And she was not the only one that held that, but that was one of the data points that struck out at me. There was this sense of, and we're going to come back to this a little bit later too, this dismissal of the treble choir. This really came up with one of my conductors, Bob, but then it came up in a different way down the line that we'll talk about. But with Bob, it was very pronounced. It was both consciously and unconsciously. His conscious dismissal was with his treble choir, and I observed him with them. One of the students, she was a senior, she had been in the group for several years, and even then, as he was telling me that story, he was like, "Well, I guess because she likes that sound." Like she couldn't want to stay in there because it was a great place to sing. But she came to him and said, last year and in the past, we've done much more difficult music. And so he admitted to me and somewhat to her that, well, yeah, I know you could do more. And then he kind of avoided the rest of the question. But this idea of, he wasn't putting a whole lot of energy into that particular ensemble. But he talked greatly about his chamber group, and they had done the Mozart Requiem, and they had gone and sung for the governor, and they had done this, and they had done that. And then it came to this treble choir. It was like, yeah, I guess I could do more with them, but... and so that was very troubling. And again, we'll come back to a little bit of that later. Another consciously held one is I asked them outright in their pre-interview, do you teach girls and boys differently in your classroom? Do you think you do? And Diane, who was kind of mid to late career, so she had been teaching for many, many years, She was probably the most conscious of this because she looked me straight in the face and said, "You bet I do. Guys are more physical. Absolutely, I teach them differently. We get up, we move around. They like competition. So if the energy is lacking, then I turn something into a competition or a game. Who can sing this long phrase without breathing in the middle? Who can sight sing this line, the best and get the most applause?" So she was very, very conscious of that. And likewise with her girls, she said over the years, and her program was split during the school day where she taught, she had 3 levels of girls and a level of boys. And then to make her mixed choir, they met before school. So she really found that was helpful, and she liked having them separated that way because she said the girls are also different. They have a different attitude. They're much more sensitive to feedback and how she really thinks about how she gives them feedback. Whereas the guys, and this came up with her and with Bob, you could give them a hard time and it was okay, but you couldn't give the girls a hard time. Again, did you ever try giving the girls a hard time? Maybe they would laugh it off just like the boys. And then this idea of what I coined treasured boys. How the conversation always comes up. How do we recruit and retain boys in our program? And what was interesting as I was discussing this with my advisor was she brought up this idea of why do we feel like we have to have that element? Not to dismiss them, but why is that such a crucial component of what makes us feel successful as choir directors? Chris brought up the point that, so-and-so has, this many boys and has enough to make a boys' choir, like Diane had enough to do that. Chris in his program did not. Because of, and I'm sure you all know, our enrollment challenges always, the county says you must have so many in order to make a class. And so, if you only have 8 boys, to me, I would love to have 8 boys in a class. Think of how much individual vocal work you could get done. But the county says, no, you have to have, X number, 20, 15, whatever it is. To have that be an individual class. But it seemed like this competition, well, so-and-so is able to have a men's choir. And there was this unsaid thought of my program's not as prestigious because I don't have that. And also this idea to keep them, we tend to make things not as competitive because we have so many more girls. And this can happen in church choir, it can happen in a community mixed choir as well. We have so many women and we only have this handful of guys. And so when it comes to audition time, are we as competitive with that male, man, boy, whatever level you're teaching? Are we as competitive with their audition as we are with the females' auditions? How many of us, in order to make our SATB choir and, have that enrollment, push some of those boys up into that concert choir that maybe don't have all the skills that everybody else does? Oh, but it gives me 12. I can have 12 boys in that class. So, thinking about that idea of making the boys worth more than the girls in your program. And then, as I said, there were gender biases that were held unconsciously, either that went by observing that I observed either something opposite of what they had said or different than what they had said in their interview, or something that hadn't come up. And so a big piece that I found was language, gendered language. How many times are you looking at a piece? And I don't have one here, but you're looking at a piece and there's a part in the bass clef and you say, okay, who sings at measure 34? And everybody says the men do or the boys do. Well, how many of us, especially in community choir and church choir, how many of us have female tenors? Right? So I try to change that language and I say the tenors and the basses sing there, or whichever voice part it is, to get away from singing the men sing there, the boys sing there. Well, I don't know enough about, who's in the class, and especially these classes that I observed. I didn't interview the students, so I don't know if all of those boys identify as a boy. They may present that way. I have no way of knowing if that's actually how they identify. So being very careful about gendered language, that idea of guys meaning all. Chris, I observed him with his women's choir. And how many times did he say, guys, let's settle down, let's go here. And I'm thinking, you're in a room full of girls. And again, I don't know if they all identify that way, but in general, they all present it that way. But you're saying guys and guys over and over and over again. So who are we unconsciously erasing when we say that, or not engaging when we say that? When we say men sing here and there's a female tenor in the group. We really have to be careful of that. Also, this idea of heteronormativity, which basically means that anything heterocentral is the given. And so Diane was in a rehearsal with her men's chorus, and they had this long, beautiful phrase. It was this lovely ballad that they were singing, and she was trying to get them all the way to the end of this phrase. And so she said, okay, let's pretend that there's a pretty girl at the end of the phrase, and we all want to get the pretty girl at the end of the phrase. And at first I thought, okay, I get it. And then when you really think about it, well, do all the people in that room want a girl at the end of the phrase? Maybe not. So making sure that we're again, you're erasing somebody in that comment unconsciously, because I'm sure that's not what she meant to do. She was just trying to come up with something to get them to the end of that phrase. But they may not all want the girl at the end of the phrase. And I did notice that some of them kind of snickered at that. And I don't know why. Maybe it was because somebody in the room wouldn't want the girl. Maybe it was just they thought that her example was funny. Who knows? But being aware of that those types of ideas are so quick for some people, but they may not connect to everybody in the room. And again, that idea of hegemonic masculinity. What is the stereotypical guy? Chris was giving an example during warm-ups. He was trying to get a good full sound from all of his singers. Actually, it wasn't just from his basses. But in order to give that example, even though in his interview he talked extensively about trying not to have any gender bias, and he treats all of his students equally, and he wants to work with them based on their musical ability and not based on their gender, he immediately went to an example of, imagine a tenor, and he's trying to sing, he's tall and he's thin, and he's trying to sing these high notes, and his point was, don't strain for the high notes, right? But then he said, and then imagine a bass, and he's 6'4", and he's, big and strong. And so his example was meant to be a vocal example of don't strain your voice to get to the high note. Try to use the power from your center. But the example he gave is that the bass is more manly, the tenor is less. And I'm sure, again, that was not his intent, but that's essentially what he did, was say that the manly one was the one with the deep voice and was really tall and everything. And it was even the way he stood and how he held himself and how he spoke. And so again, these biases that come out that we're just not aware of in how we speak to our students. And Again, I didn't interview the students, so I cannot say scientifically how it affected them. But I can imagine, and just how it affected me being the observer, that somebody in the room probably felt something very strongly about that. So again, it came down to language in the classroom. It really didn't come down to the repertoire that I looked at. I think, again, as I said at the beginning, I think our ideas have evolved a lot around repertoire, that our TTBB choirs are not just singing sea shanties anymore, and our treble choirs are not just singing love songs. I think that has come a long way. So what it really came down to was how we're teaching them, not so much what, but the how. Whom are we erasing in the classroom? I come back to Bob as an example. His girls were girls and his boys were men. Whenever he addressed them or even spoke to me in our interview, he would talk about girls and about men. So right there's a big differential there of calling somebody a girl and calling somebody a man. And I noticed that, of course, having done this research now, I'm heightened to these things in conversation now, how so many times when we talk about boys in secondary school, right, most of them are under the age of 18, we're afraid to say boy because of the connotation in our society that creates. That we might not be ready to call them men, so we call them guys. Because that seems to be kind of safe. We're not calling them boys because the word little tends to come into our mind before that word little boys, right? Young, immature, and of course, vocally speaking, right? Voice hasn't changed, things like that. So we're afraid to do that. But so in his classroom, they were girls and they were men. And that's where that again struck me about his whole idea with that treble chorus. That, well, they could do more, but they were singing, this was in the fall. I did my research in the fall, and in the winter, at their winter concert, they always sang, like many of us have done, they sang the Hallelujah chorus from Handel's Messiah. And if you're a soprano, you know that sits up there, right? For the Lord God. It goes way up there. And so when we were talking in our interview, he was talking about this, and he was saying, they just don't have it. They don't have those notes yet. These girls, they're not there yet vocally. And I thought to myself, I sang Handel's Messiah every winter concert from freshman year to senior year, and I don't ever remember having trouble singing it because my director spent lots of time warming us up, doing vocal exercises. When I sat and observed him with his treble choir, they never sang up to a G. So of course they don't have it because he's not helping them get there. So, and again, he just dismisses it. Well, they don't have it, so we're just going to move on. So again, that idea that's all encompassed in this girls and men situation. So think about how you address students in your classroom. Are they ladies and gentlemen? Are they boys and girls? Are they guys and girls? Is everybody guys? Or do you call on them by their voice parts? Again, going back to that example of who sings here. Not the men, the tenors and the basses sing here, or not the girls or the women, the sopranos and the altos sing here. We have to really shift our thinking. Even in rehearsal, instead of saying, girls, sing over here, say, if you really want the sopranos, we're smart enough to say sopranos, sing measure 35. So we can do that all the time. We can say sopranos and altos. And again, in the classroom, think about your freshmen. When I was growing up, a freshman year, my friend Jason Browder, his voice hadn't changed. And so what do you do with that freshman boy who identifies as a boy, but his voice hasn't changed yet? And this was our situation back then. This is 1992, a little while ago, was, nobody at that point in Fairfax County, there weren't any men's choirs. We just didn't do that then. Everybody had mixed choirs and treble choirs, or women's choirs. And so what do you do with Jason? Do you put him in the women's chorus because he's still a soprano, maybe an alto? Do you exclude him altogether and say, I don't have a place for you? Of course we don't want to do that. Do you force him to try to be a tenor before he's really a tenor and put him in the mixed choir? So, again, he was brave enough. He said, I'll go into chorale. We didn't call it women's chorale. We just called it chorale, but it was an SSAA choir. And he was brave enough. So I'll wear my tux and stand in that soprano section. And he did for a year. And then the next year he came back and he was a bass too. But not everybody's going to be that brave. So, if you are in that situation, then of course, with my friend Jason, do you walk around the whole time and call them girls, 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 girls? No, you say soprano ones, sing here, soprano twos, altos. So shifting that thinking of identifying our singers by voice part, or of course by their name, if it's an individual situation that you want an individual to sing, or to answer a question. But getting out of this boys and girls, or, whichever iteration here on the slide that you tend to use. Also looking at the structuring of the choral program. And again, this is more school-based. But again, yes, you can go almost anywhere, and you're going to tend to have more girls than boys in the program in general. So where is your treble choir? I read several papers on the status of that treble choir, that many times it is a younger voice, freshman, maybe some sophomores in there, and then you move up. And notice I said up. You don't move to a different choir, you move up. You move up to the chamber choir, you move up to the concert choir. And so there tends to be this idea that women's choruses, or now we tend to call them treble choirs, that the treble choir is less than. And again, I think that that's an unconscious thing to the director. I don't think any director goes in to a choral program saying that, well, maybe Bob, I don't know, that the treble choir is less than, but how do you talk about them? How do you challenge them? In his case, he was not challenging them at all. So why would you want to stay there if there's no challenge? However, one year when I was teaching in a high school, I was in the situation where I inherited, like most of us, we inherit a program, and that was kind of the thing. The girls started here. All the boys went into the concert choir, no matter what their skill level was. And so when I inherited that, I realized how much some of those boys were really struggling, because they were expected to sing things, that were more difficult than they had learned, more difficult harmonies, rhythms, things like that, but also more difficult in the tessitura because their voices were still very young and developing and changing. And so a couple years in, I think it was maybe my second or third year, I think it was my third year, I flipped it. And the concert choir was my beginning choir, because I had all these girls that were so talented, and I couldn't give them, when they had these younger voiced gentlemen in there, I couldn't give them the challenging music that they craved. And I could tell that the year before they kind of felt that way. So I flipped it, and my chamber choir was SSAA. And actually Abby, in her program, her chamber choir that year was SSAA for the same reason. She had had a bubble of tenors and basses that had all graduated, and the new tenors and basses coming in were, again, younger, newer to singing. They hadn't had a lot of experience in music reading and choral singing in general. And so she did the same thing. Her chamber choir was an SSAA choir. And we had a long conversation about how hard that was to shift the culture. Because the same thing happened to me when I flipped it. The juniors and senior girls all came to me with this, we've been demoted feeling. What do you mean we're in treble choir? I said, no, you're in chamber choir. It's just SSAA music, because you're all advanced and you're ready to do more advanced music. But I had to convince them all year that having a mixed choir did not make the music better. It just makes it different. The harmonies are different, the sound is different, the timbre is different literature. But there's nothing wrong, there's nothing less about having an advanced treble choir, that there's great, challenging, wonderful music out there. And again, this was in the early 2000s, and I think that treble music has come a long way in the last 20 years. Because at the beginning it was kind of hard to find some really meaty text to sing. But there's been wonderful, wonderful compositions for women's choirs, for treble singers. And then we come back to what I was talking about at the beginning, the idea of naming our choirs. And this was an interesting development because, of course, doing doctoral research and writing takes several years to put together sometimes, like mine did. And so in the middle of, between my data collection as I started writing and interpreting it, this whole conversation came about we don't want women's and men's choirs anymore because it is not inclusive. And I was so excited to see that. I know in several counties, school districts, you are not allowed to have men's choir, women's choir. You can have treble choir, basso choir, but it is named for the voicing of the group. I mean, you can throw out the treble and bass and just have your, Panther choir or your Eagle choir or whatever. But the description of it is about the voicing of the choir, so that it is becoming more inclusive. And I think that's wonderful. It's shifting the focus of what we do. We don't train genders, we train voices. And so we want to make it as educationally sound as possible. So it's going to be a much easier situation, like for my friend Jason, if he could have gone into even a treble choir. I mean, again, we called it Choral, so I think that probably helped. But so much easier for someone who identifies as non-binary, for a student who may be transitioning, for a student who identifies as transgender, for a student who's just not comfortable wearing a dress. That's the other question, is naming and then costuming. I know plenty of people that identify as female and hate wearing dresses. And it was kind of interesting. My advisor and I came through this discussion about who came up with the idea of tuxes and gowns anyway. Like, who was the first person to do that? I don't know. I didn't go down that road, but it is interesting how we came to, it used to be choir robes, and then choir robes became very sacred, church-oriented. And so then it became this tux and gown situation. And so I think I'm seeing a lot of choral programs moving away from that as well, and just picking everybody wear blue or go back to the old black and white, something that everybody has, and that you can feel comfortable in. So I think the structure is beginning to change, but I think there's a lot of culture to that we also have to shift. Again, about that idea of, I got to hang on to my boys. I got to treat them really well, and I got to be really nice to them so that they don't leave my program. And where that treble choir is, do we always want that to be thought of as the bottom? Patriarchal, say that 10 times fast, attitudes. This shows up in different ways again. Yes, the idea of male privilege. It was interesting when I did my pre-interviews and I asked them if they felt that they were ever treated differently based on their gender. Abby happened to tell me a story. She was trained both in choral and in band. So she's certified in both. Her current position was just choral, but she had been in split positions before. And she was very quick to say, definitely in the band world, that I was always thought of as cute, as, if there were any girl problems in the marching band, they would be sent to me. And Bob, very interestingly, said, I've never really been asked that question. Well, of course he hasn't been asked that question, because male is still the standard in our society. So why would he ever be asked that question? The idea of the traditional music canon, that is another patriarchal attitude, that the dead white male European composer is the epitome of our music still. And so there's still a lot of sense that that's the legitimacy of our program. That came up with Bob too, when I asked about the type of literature that the different ensembles study. And we do a lot of everything, but let me tell you about this Mozart Requiem. And he went on for ages about this Mozart Requiem, which again, to me, I say, oh, masterwork, right? Well, there's lots of masterworks now. They're not all by dead white male European composers. But there's still this feeling of, we have to do that, and then we can kind of sprinkle in the other stuff. And so to really think about why we're choosing the music we're choosing, and that's coming up a lot now. We've had a lot of webinars over the last few weeks about, of course, we don't want any cultural misappropriation, but we also don't want tokenism, right? We don't want to just check the box. And so, if we are going to pick a masterwork, why are we picking that masterwork? What are the students getting out of it? Of course, they should learn some masterworks because that is an important part of our music history. But we shouldn't hang the legitimacy of our program on just that. And then the idea of the gendered nature of choral rehearsal itself. Because male is the standard, it is also the power. So our director, no matter what your actual gender identity is, in the structure of a choral rehearsal, you are gendered male because you hold the power, you hold the knowledge, and you make all the decisions. So is it time to change that as well? Is it time to rethink how we structure a rehearsal and how we make decisions and who makes decisions in the rehearsal? So what does this mean for us? And then we'll have time for some questions. Acknowledge gender. You have to acknowledge gender just like you acknowledge race. We have to get out of this idea that I am gender blind, I am race blind. No, you can't be. All of diversity is important, and we shouldn't be blind to it. We should recognize it, and we should acknowledge it, and we should make our decisions with that in mind. How we're talking to our choirs, what music we are bringing to them. That use of gendered neutral language, call students by their name or their voice part, get out of the men sing here and the women sing here, or the boys and girls or whatever. Get out of that and start talking about voice parts. Sopranos sing here and then the tenors join them. Awareness of our heteronormative language and our music choices. That idea, that example that Diane brought about, assuming that all the boys in the room want the girl at the end of the phrase. Really thinking about that. And it is so ingrained that we don't realize it. And that's the whole point of the word heteronormativity, that's the norm. Just being aware of it. And then, do you consider how you're naming and how you're uniforming your singers? When I did my post interviews, the most common out of all four, they all said, it made me really stop and think more about how I'm talking and how I'm teaching and choosing music. And that's the whole point, is to become more aware of what we're doing, and not only what we're doing, but why we're doing it that way. So here's my contact information if you would like to talk more. I would love to talk about it, and I'm going to turn it back over to CJ so that we can address any questions that have come up. Thank you.
And thank you, Marianne. I know a lot of the comments that have been coming through over the chat have been very supportive of a lot of these threads that you brought in front of us. So thank you so much. One of the comments that was made, and I think Amy's behind the ACDA Voices United person on the chat right now, but they mentioned that deep voices equal manly, but the tenor voice is more prominent in Broadway and pop music especially. And I thought that would be an interesting comment for you to respond to.
That is very interesting. And that's something that actually I hadn't really thought of. But you're right. And I think especially in more recent musical theater, you're absolutely right. And even if you think of pop music, most male pop singers, again, I'm assuming that they are identifying as male, sing in a tenor range. Absolutely. And so that, of course, was not part of my study. But that would be an interesting road to go down to see, not just there, but even opera, to look at roles and how roles are portrayed in vocal tessitura would be very interesting.
And then one of the questions that came up specifically was, what are some of the terms that you can suggest to us to address our ensembles? You talked a lot about, when you're addressing a section or a group of sections, tenors and basses, sopranos and altos. But what are some of the words that you might suggest to us for that moment at the beginning of the rehearsal when, especially those of us who grew up in the Northeast, y'all doesn't always work for us. So
Absolutely. You're right. And that's where I would say, you can just as easily say good morning, everyone. Because no, we don't want to go down the litany where it would take us 10 minutes to say good morning to everyone in the room. But even the word everyone is much better than guys, because everyone truly is everyone. It's that idea of getting away from words like mankind, which, it's supposed to mean humankind. Well, then say humankind. It's not that hard. So thinking more generally in those ways. But yes, if you are Southern, I'm sure y'all works just as well.
I know personally I use folks a lot because it's a good short word to get attention.
Yeah.
Someone in the chat said, hello, fellow earthlings always gets a giggle. So
there you go. Get creative. Absolutely.
And then you did speak a little bit to the dress code, but what are some of the things that you might have come across?
Uniform.
Are there any other specific suggestions you would?
Yeah, it didn't come up a lot in the interview, except with one, and that was Chris brought up how often he feels uncomfortable and unsure about how to approach a female singer that maybe is having trouble with the zipper on her dress. Things like that, or that wants to talk to him about, I'm not comfortable in this dress, I don't. And he had a lot of angst over that. And so again, somehow we've gotten to this tux and gown thing. And quite frankly, that was the bane of my existence when I was a secondary teacher, was choosing uniforms, and it still is. My community choir, that's where I say church choir robes, fantastic. But really thinking about, and not just in the gender sense, but also in the socioeconomic sense. What makes sense for your demographic? With something like getting a t-shirt with the school logo on it, and then everybody wears a black something on the bottom, whatever they're comfortable with. Um, you know, you can sing just as well in a t-shirt as you can in a tux. And so not to be set on this, yes, it's a visual experience. I firmly believe that choral music is as much visual as oral, but we can look just as uniform without being cookie cutter with it. If you gave everybody the school colors, find something in your school colors, great. You still have a uniform idea, but there's a chance for individuality and comfort. And I think that's the most important thing. Do you want to keep people out of your choral program because they don't want to wear that tux?
And I know personally in my program a couple years ago, we went to all black, and then you had your choice. You had a scarf or a necktie, and pick which one you wanted to wear. So that gave us the uniformity, because that color was exactly the same across the entire ensemble.
Yep, yep. And I love that you gave a choice, whichever one you want to wear. I'm not going to tell you, you tell me. Absolutely.
So I'm not seeing any. We are a couple seconds behind. We're a couple seconds ahead of the YouTube, but
Yep.
I'm not seeing any other questions coming up. I know that folks are always welcome to email our presenters. Um, and so I would just like to take a moment to thank you for the work you've done on today's presentation. We also need to thank a few people behind the scenes. Amy Moyer was our technical coordinator today. Max Nolan has been doing a lot of the editing and scheduling of all of our pre-made sessions. And of course, Voices United does not happen without a committee of, I believe it's up to like 17 people now that put this conference on every year. So thank you to the fellow members of our committee. Thank
Yes.
you again, Dr. East. And um, thank you. This is a lot for us to think about, and a great thing to bring up at this time.
Great. Thank you. I've truly enjoyed it. And please do reach out if you have any other questions or anything that you would like to discuss. Thank you very much, CJ.
Thank you.